Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figure It Out Productions. The following video is part of our Quick Shoot series.
Hey guys, it's Adam here, and today I'd like to talk to you about the Retro VGS. Now this is a subject that a lot of you have asked me to talk about. It's also a subject that I've wanted to talk about ever since it was first announced. However, since it first was announced, I've had two totally conflicting emotions towards it, two totally conflicting thought processes on it. And I was hoping that with more information coming out that I would kind of pick a side, but I haven't really been able to do that. So I just said, no more dilly-dallying, let's talk about all of this and maybe see where you guys stand. Maybe you guys can convince me to swing one way or the other, I don't know, but let's just go ahead and start talking here. So the Retro VGS, if you're not aware of what it is at all, stands for the Retro Video Game System. It's essentially a proposed new video game console that would be released presumably next year or the year after, I don't know. However, it's not competition for, say, like the Xbox One, the PS4, or the Wii U, or whatever the NX ends up being. It's not on that technical level. It's not aimed at that crowd. It's not something you would see at a Best Buy or a Media Markt if you're in Europe. It's something that would only be sold online and is aimed exclusively at essentially people like me. It's essentially a console that uses cartridges. It has the technical prowess of about the PlayStation 1 is what they keep saying. And it's a DRM-free console with no installation and no downloads, no patches, none of that crap. It's just, you put the game in and it works. It's meant to appeal to that kind of nostalgia for the good old days, yet give you a new library, right? That's the idea. Now, this console is interesting for a lot of reasons. One of which, it's the elephant in the room that everybody needs to talk about, is it looks like an Atari Jaguar. Now, or Jaguar, I know the British always get upset when us across the pond, us Americans, Canadians probably too, always screw up the pronunciation, but Jaguar is just how we say it, I'm sorry. But yeah, a lot of people question why that was. The simple reason that they give is that they bought the molds for it and that's why they're using it. Now, if you want to know why, I can only speculate, but there's two reasons I would assume there. One is consoles are really, really expensive to produce. Way more so than people think. So when you don't have to spend the money to design and engineer and produce new molds, you essentially just kind of turn on the old machines, put some plastic in there and make them. That's a huge savings. So I think that's why they did that. That's the primary reason. The secondary reason, which I think is just kind of a bonus effect of that, is that if your console looks like the Jaguar, the retro gamer's brain immediately associates that with being a game console. So it gives it some psychological validity, basically, which is good. Of course, then that comes with its own problems, because then people think, well, I didn't like the Jaguar, or does it play Jaguar games? Does it work with a Jaguar CD, etc.? It's not a Jaguar. Okay, inside, it's not a Jaguar, like at all. It won't run Jaguar games, it won't run the Jaguar CD, it is not a Jaguar, it's its own thing. It just looks like one externally. So just to clear that up. And if you're going to ask, well, why didn't they use Super Nintendo molds or something like that? It's because Nintendo still exists. They would never let them do that. The Atari Jaguar molds are unique. For those who don't know, when Atari went under, one of the things they did to kind of cut some of their losses is they found a bidder for the Jaguar molds, and that bidder was a hygienic company for dental equipment. Yeah, the Jaguar was turned into dental equipment later in its life, which is kind of funny. So my guess is that the Retro VGS dudes bought that mold from the hygienic company, and it's kind of coming full circle to become a video game console again, which is kind of nice. So that basically catches you up on what this thing is. It's a console that wants to use physical media, cartridges, to bring about a bunch of indie developed games. Okay, so you wouldn't see AAA games, like Ubisoft, EA, etc. They're not going to be making games for this. But indie devs whose games are really only distributed digitally on things like the Xbox One, Steam, PS4, etc., they could make games for this to get physical versions out there. Okay, so that's the idea. Now, they went to Indiegogo with this concept. Indiegogo is very similar to Kickstarter, same basic idea, crowdfunding. You put in the money, and essentially you're pre-ordering the console, and your money goes to actually fund development of all of this thing, and then it gets produced. That's the idea. Their goal was $2 million, okay, just for the most basic needs to make this console happen. After about 2 weeks, they only reached 65 grand, which is like 3% of their goal. To put that in perspective, Shenmue 3 which didn't meet the expectations of a lot of people who were hopeful that it would reach 10 million, myself included. It reached 6.3. Slacker backer campaign still on. I'll put the link in the description. You can still fund Shenmue through PayPal. I know, cheap plug. It made $2 million in 9 hours. Okay, so the point is that if you put that in perspective there, the Retro VGS, as the actual people behind it described it, was dead in the water. The Indiegogo campaign was not going anywhere, which was unfortunate, but it is what it is. So what they've told people now, if you did back the Indiegogo, you can withdraw your pledge. They're canceling that whole thing. However, the Retro VGS is not dead. Otherwise, there would be no point even talking about any of this at all. Other than to do like, look what could have been. But we're not doing that, because it could still become. That's the idea. Now, I don't know what their plans are to change anything, to try and raise different funds through different means or whatever. We're not really here to talk about that, though I might give them some suggestions at the end. I still just want to talk about the console in general, the whole concept behind it. Because as I said, since the beginning, I've been completely conflicted with two different opposing standpoints. I describe myself as an optimistic pragmatist, which means I'm hopeful, but I'm realistic. Which is why when I would make things about, for example, Shenmue 3, when I would say, it can happen, but I would say it has to happen this way, even if I don't even want it to happen that way, it has to. You have to follow certain pragmatic rules to get something you dream of to happen. So that's just how I function. Now, that often works together, and sometimes they oppose each other. And in this case, they massively oppose each other. So the optimistic side of me heard about the Retro VGS and was like, yes, that is so awesome. Because again, I don't support digital games. And I know I'm in the minority on that. I know that not everyone agrees with that position, and I would never tell anybody they have to change on that. That's up to each person to decide. So to me, when I heard the games like, let's say, Volcar the Viking. Actually, to be fair, I don't know if that was coming to the Retro VGS or not, but let's just use it as an example, because it's got some notoriety right now. That's a digital game on Xbox One. It's on Steam. I don't know if it's on PS4 or not. It actually just got ported to the Dreamcast, which is kind of funny. However, that version is, you have to burn it onto a CDR. It wasn't given like an official press release or anything. However, if you want to play it on your Dreamcast, you can do that now. Totally legit and for free. Now, okay, so a game like that has no official physical release could theoretically get a physical release on the Retro VGS. And to me, that would be awesome. Okay? To me, that would be very exciting. But the problem with that, though, is that someone like me is going to say, okay, 30 bucks for this cartridge, that's cool, whatever, I'll back it, that's awesome. But then there's that other part that goes, not everyone else is going to do that. Most people aren't going to look at that and say like, oh, I'm definitely going to put down like the $400 or $500 to buy this console, plus like the $30 to potentially $60 for the cartridge to play Volcar the Viking on physical form, or I could just pay like $3 on Steam. I don't know what it actually costs on Steam, I'm just saying. Point is, most people aren't going to do that. So it wasn't really that hard to predict that the Indiegogo campaign was not going to work. And again, that's where the other half of me comes in. The realist in me knew this was never going to work, at least not through the means that they were doing. Which makes me sad, because again, I wanted it to work, I just knew it wouldn't. I guess I can summarize the Retro VGS's problems in basically one sentence, which is, it has all the disadvantages of the N64, but none of the advantages. And what I mean by that is that the N64, whether you love it, you hate it, whatever, I like that console, okay? But that console, it's hard to deny that it had problems. Its problems all stem from the fact that it used cartridges when all of its competition used CDs. Its games primarily were much more expensive to produce because cartridges are simply physically, they contain things, they contain metal, they contain plastic, they contain all sorts of stuff. Okay? It's much more expensive to produce one than it is to just simply stamp a disc. That's much cheaper. It also had technical limitations. Most N64 games could only hold up to 8 megabytes of storage. The biggest one was like Resident Evil 2, which I think held 128 megabytes. And that cartridge was so expensive that even when they put it out in stores, they were losing money on every single unit sold. Meaning that, I don't know exactly what the cartridge costs. Let's say it cost $100 to produce one physical cartridge. They were putting it in the store and selling it for $60. So you're always losing money. Now, and if you bring up megabits, no, there's 512 megabits in an N64. Megabits is not the same as megabytes. So I just want to set the record clear on that. It's a very different unit of measurement. Not that that really matters. So it had that limitation. It wasn't capable of high fidelity audio. It wasn't capable of FMV support really. So it had all these issues, and whereas its competition didn't have that problem, you know, they could all do that, and for cheaper. So, but the N64 had pluses, right? It had the ability, it had Nintendo behind it, really, frankly. It had a multi-billion-dollar naming gaming behind it that just said, okay, we're going to bring you all our first-party IPs, you know, we're going to give you the Marios, the Zeldas, we're going to give you Star Fox, all that great shit that we all associate the N64 with. So it had that and tons of money behind it, and also its competition was really the same era. You know, it was the PS1 and the Saturn for the most part. I mean, I personally did a whole series on the 5th generation of game consoles. It was more than just those three, but by the time the N64 was out, those were the only three that mattered. Point is, it didn't have to deal with digital distribution as a competitor. It didn't have that problem. It just had all these other pluses that the VGS does not. So the VGS has the same technical issues, probably isn't even as advanced technologically, and it just doesn't have the money, obviously, based on the way the Indiegogo campaign worked. And I don't know, man, it just it bums me out, because I would love to see that project succeed, but I just don't see how that's ever going to happen. So yeah, that's really where I stand on these two things, is that I really want it to work. I want this to happen because I love the idea, but I just don't think it really can. And the other part of it that confuses me is that if you're looking for a platform to make indie games in a physical format, that console already exists. Okay, it's called the Sega Dreamcast. Now, I know. A lot of people are going to say, of course you would mention the Dreamcast, you're a Dreamcast super fan, blah, blah, blah. I don't deny that I'm completely in love with the Sega Dreamcast. That's no secret whatsoever. But even if I hated that console, I would still make this exact same point, which is that the Dreamcast, undeniably a more advanced piece of machinery than the Retro VGS. Also, its parent company does not give a crap about it, Sega. They don't care if you develop games for it. Yes, new Dreamcast games still come out, believe it or not, by independent developers. Sega doesn't stop anybody from doing that. They don't ask for royalties. They don't do anything with it. They don't care at all. They're, of course, disc-based media, so it's much cheaper, etc. If you're not aware, I mean, the Dreamcast is capable of doing independent stuff because of its mil-CD exploit. I explained that whole thing here. I'm not going to bother with that. Point is, independent developers can make games for the Dreamcast just as easily as they can for the Retro VGS, but actually easier. Because not only do they don't have to worry about the consoles, they're already out there. People already have them. People are already associated with gaming. It already has a community. You see what I'm saying? It just has a ton of advantages. There's only one disadvantage to the Dreamcast, which is it's limited to 16 megabytes of RAM. Now, the way I understand this, and I'm not a developer, I'm not a programmer, so I could be very wrong in the exact way I express this, but my understanding is basically when you were talking about the original Sega run with Dreamcast games, anything that Sega put out or the major companies put out, what they would do is the game would load, right? So it would load a certain amount of content into the RAM so that the player could use that, and then when you went to another area and it would load something else, it would wipe the RAM and put in the new content. Essentially, in the most watered down explanation possible, that's how it would work. A lot of the indie games don't work like that, though. They'll take the entire game and just shove it into the RAM, except for the music, which they'll put on the disc, of course, and then the console keeps reading it for music, almost like it's a music CD. Right? That's how a lot of them tend to work. That's the reason that apparently Neo Geo dev team, the guys who made Fast Striker and Gunlord, etc., apparently that's the primary reason they stopped working on the Dreamcast, because the RAM limitation was just too small. Whereas when they work on the Neo Geo AES, because it's a cartridge, you can put RAM inside the console and then it can compensate, really. So the Retro VGS would theoretically have that advantage over the Dreamcast. But my point is basically just that if you want to do an indie console that it can support physical media, that console kind of already exists. And that's why the VGS, another reason the VGS kind of seems pointless in that regard. But again, that doesn't mean I don't think it's really neat. I love consoles. I love when new ones get announced. I love talking about, see, to me a console isn't just the games and that's it. To me a console is its history, what it looks like, what it can do, what it can't do, what its exclusive features are, what the controller's shaped like, all that stuff. Just the minutia that is a console to me is always exciting. Which is why I would spend this long talking about something that's not even here. It's just theoretical. So yeah, I guess that's kind of where I stand with the VGS, is that I don't know if that thing can ever work. I'm sure what they're going to do with it is they're going to find ways to make it cheaper and give us another shot. If I had to give them some suggestions, I would say take a play out of Nintendo, or take a page out of Nintendo's playbook here. Nintendo did a lot of revamped versions of their consoles to make them cheaper. The VGS, when you look at it, for something that's supposed to be plug and play, it sure as shit looks complicated. I know it's not, but it just looks like it because it has way too many ports on it. It's got 2 USB ports in the front plus 2 DIMM9 controller ports on it, which is like what you would use for the Genesis, basically. On the back, it's got all sorts of other ports on it, HDMI ports, composite ports, I think S-Video, I don't even totally remember. They wanted to give you like this, you know, Ferrari of potential game consoles for retro purposes, but it's too much shit. You know, it's expensive to produce those things. What Nintendo would always do is they would strip out the stuff you didn't need and just give you the most basic stuff, which I don't usually advocate, but in this case, I think you kind of have to do that. I would say, if it was up to me, I'd say just go with the 2 USB ports and the HDMI port in the back, plus of course a power supply. I know a lot of people don't like that because they want to be able to use like composite with the CRT for, you know, the retro nostalgic feel, but just if it's designed to use HDMI, then that doesn't have a point. But that's just me. By the end of the N64's lifespan, despite being this console we all think of as a great success, right? I'm sure even if you didn't like it, you acknowledge, yeah, it was still a successful console. It only ended up with something like 300 games worldwide. Now the Dreamcast, on the other hand, and I know I keep harping on the Dreamcast, but it's just because it's a good example of this. The Dreamcast, which is considered a massive failure. People love it, but it failed, right? I mean, even I'm a super fan. I admit it failed. It did not ultimately succeed financially. In North America alone, it ended up with 248 games. Worldwide, if you include all the stuff that was released in Europe that we never got in North America, or all the stuff that Japan got that Europe and North America never got, it had around 800. Yet that one is perceived as the failure. And if the Retro VGS can't even do what the N64 does, from a marketing standpoint, there's no way it gets to 300 games. Frankly, that console would be lucky if it ended up at 10. And I know there's a lot of games that are supposedly were in plan for it, but you know, how many of those ever end up getting released? And when it comes to the cartridges themselves, you know, what do? Do you make conventional cartridges? Like, this is, again, I'm not an engineer, but conventional cartridges, a lot of people now misconstrue and think, oh, that's the same thing as like SD cards now. They were just bigger. Not really. Cartridges are more like RAM in that sense. They're big chipsets, whereas SD cards are just little flimsy pieces of storage data. Now, the advantage to cartridges in that sense is that cartridges really can be read a lot. You know, like they can be taken in, you know, inserted and removed so many times and it doesn't really matter. Whereas SD cards, flash cards, those type of things, they have a finite amount of times that you can do that, even under totally normal use and good care, where they just stop working. And you can't make a game console with that in mind because there's only so many times you could put the cartridge in before it just stops functioning. But on the other hand, it would be much cheaper to produce these basically empty plastic cases that just have a little bit of SD card-like media at the bottom to connect to something in the console. So, you know, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. That's really perfectly surmises the Retro VGS's situation. It's damned if it does, it's damned if it doesn't. I don't know what to tell them. I would love for this thing to be successful, but unfortunately the Indiegogo campaign proved that it probably, that, you know, pessimistic part of me, that realistic part of me, I guess I should say, who ultimately in this case is pessimistic, is probably correct. Even though that optimist in me would love to be able to be like, oh yeah, that game that was digitally everywhere else, I got a fucking physical cartridge of it. Hell yeah. I would be super stoked about that. And I will support it if it seems like this actually has a chance of getting off the ground with whatever this next version is, but yeah. I guess that's it, guys. I know this is kind of all, I'm just thinking out loud, basically, but that's really where I stand with it, is that I wish it well, I hope it works, I don't see how it's going to, at least at this point in time. So what do you guys think? Leave your thoughts in the comments, let me know. Did any of you actually support the original Indiegogo campaign? Did you even know about it? Etc. Will you potentially support whatever they do next? Yeah, I guess that's really it, guys. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you all later.